Good evening, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Lee Smith, and I'm the current Vice Postmark of the Brooklyn, Long Island Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. As part of our community service efforts, the Brooklyn, Long Island Alumni Chapter regularly hosts community events to educate our constituents on issues that affect us all. The pandemic has, of course, forced a lot of our efforts to virtual spaces, but the need to continue our education efforts around these issues is now more important than ever. Tonight, we're back and in partnership with a great panel of thought leaders, educators, and experts who will walk us through tonight's topic, Real Talk. What is critical race theory and why is it such an issue in our politics? So at this time, let us welcome our panelists, starting with Angie Hood. Ms. Angie Hood graduated in 1997 from Alabama A&M University, where she studied early childhood elementary education, and then graduated in 2003 from Indiana University, where she studied educational technology. Ms. Hood has been a teacher for 23 years and taught in Indiana and Georgia. She currently teaches for MSD of Warren Township as a family consumer science teacher. And Ms. Hood prepares high school students in the education professions program at the Walker Career Center who want to become daycare and preschool teachers. She is also a member of the ISTA, Indiana State Teachers Association, where she serves as Building Association Representative, a minority member at large on the IPACE, which is Indiana Political Action Committee for Education, and a state delegate for the NEA, the National Education Association. So welcome, Ms. Hood. Next, we have Dr. Tamika Robinson. Tamika is the Senior Associate Dean of the Rabinowitz Honors College and a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy at Hofstra University, my alma mater. Dr. Robinson earned a BS in biology and speech communication from McNeese State University, an MA in communication from Texas A&M University, and a PhD in health education from Texas A&M. Her scholarship focuses primarily in the areas of health, culture, and argumentation and debate, and appears in multiple journals, including the Journal of Health Science, Journal of International Crisis and Risk Communication, to name a few. Her co-authored book, Jogos Olympicos 2016, was released in Brazil in 2020. Dr. Robinson is also currently serving as the immediate past president of the Pi Kappa Delta National Forensics Honorary Association and the international liaison for the International Forensics Association. She was also recently inducted into the 2021 National Forensics Association Hall of Fame for her work with the intercollegiate speech and debate community. Dr. Robinson is frequently invited to give lectures throughout the US and Brazil and regularly gives commentary to regional and national news organizations about issues of politics, health, and race. And finally, we have Dr. Kalila L. Brown Dean. She is the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs and Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University. She holds a BA in government from the University of Virginia and a PhD in political science from the Ohio State University. Previously, she served as senior director for the Inclusive Excellence at Quinnipiac, where she oversaw campus-wide efforts to develop curricular, professional, co-curricular, and experiential offerings that enhance equity. She is the founder of the Inclusive Excellence Teaching Lab, an interdisciplinary cohort of scholars with a demonstrated commitment to and an interest in equity-driven learning. Her scholarship appears in numerous academic and public outlets to center the role of identity in shaping access to democracy, justice, and representation. Her most recent publications explore voting rights, civic engagement, and the politics of punishment. She is the author of Identity Politics in the United States and a co-author with Ray Block Jr. of Penn State University of a new project entitled Protesting Vulnerability, Race and Pandemic Politics. She has held elected and appointed positions in the American Political Science Association, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, the Association of Ethnic Studies, and is the immediate past board chair of the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. She has also been a highly sought after political analyst with contributions from the New York Times, MSNBC, LA Times, Fox News Radio, Universal Media Group, and the Congressional Black Caucus, Democracy Now!, and other outlets. She hosts the weekly Connecticut public radio show, podcast called Disrupted, and is passionate about inclusive community development. In 2021, the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame recognized her as a spotlight recipient for social justice, and the Connecticut State Conference of NAACP branches named her one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the state. Whew. Now that's a lot of education on this panel for tonight. So welcome, ladies. I had to get through your bios just to let folks know that are tuning in tonight that we have amassed a very, very in-depth panel of educators who are going to walk us through this topic tonight with a very sound hand as we work through this. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. So for our viewers tonight, please start to drop your questions in the chat feature on our pages, wherever you're tuning in, and get your questions answered around this topic. It's definitely a hot button and something that I'm really, really interested in. So panelists, let's jump right into the boogeyman of the topic. And anyone can take this particular question. I actually would like all of you all to give us some in-depth, answer on this question. But what is CRT, or for those that are just tuning in who have heard CRT, CRT is known as critical race theory. So where is it taught and why is it taught?
I'm happy to jump in. I think the perception is that educators like Angie are teaching little children to hate other people based on their race. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Critical race theory started with legal scholars who said, why is it in the United States, with policies like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, why is it that in spite of that legislation and those policies, we still have the Harlem race riots in 1964 after a Black teenager was hurt by a police officer and others die? Why is it that we have to shut down public schools on Long Island in the 1980s? Because people were afraid that people who look like me were moving into the neighborhoods and into the schools. Why do we see the Crown Heights riots in the 1990s? Why is it hard for people with all of that education to still have a difficult time getting a job because of their name or because of the perceptions about them? Critical race theory simply says, in the United States, issues of race and racism are embedded into the fabric of the institutions that are here. You can't have a country that was formed and benefited from the chattel slavery of African people without that legacy continuing. So it's not about the people when we look at critical race theory. It's about the policy and the process and the opportunity. And I'll take it a step further. Critical race theory isn't just about how Black people experience that because of those institutions. Critical race theory also helps us understand why when you would walk through the streets of New York City, you would see signs that say, no Jews, no Blacks, no Irish, no dogs need apply. And so we've gone from a law school theory, a legal teaching and understanding of the law, to now people using that to incite fear, to create policies that address a boogeyman that doesn't exist while ignoring the realities that do.
Thank you for that.
I want to echo some of the things that my colleague just said about, especially that it is beyond just looking at how the laws impact people of African descent, because even looking at the founders of it. So this theory was founded in 1989 with, as my colleague just said, within legal scholars. So we're looking at Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda, Richard Delgado, and a host of others from all different races and backgrounds who really wanted to look at how do these institutions function and how are our laws undergirded by the perpetuation of race. So within critical race theory, there are 5 central themes. The first one is looking at the centrality and intersectionality of race and racism. So it's really looking at how those things interact and how they intersect in a myriad of different ways. The second theme is a challenge to the dominant ideology. And we know that the ways in which our nation was founded, the ways in which laws were constructed, all had a very intentional purpose. So it's really looking at how do we think beyond those ideas that people of color were somehow inferior to people of whites, and how those laws and the construction of the laws really perpetuated those same myths. The third theme is a commitment to social justice. And it's really looking at what can we do, how can we change those laws, and how can we challenge the way those laws are. The fourth is the centrality of experiential knowledge, and really knowing how do we get people to tell their stories, and really thinking about what are some of those alternative narratives that exist that really do challenge those dominant narratives that we have been told over and over again. And this is where there is some confusion, because that does think about the ways in which we even talk about our history. Telling the truth about our history isn't critical race theory or the boogeyman, but there are some commonalities in that by challenging these stories that we continue telling, and these stories that we keep reiterating over and over again, and saying, wait a minute, there's some other stuff that's missing there, and let's really dig deeper into what's there. And then the last theme is really looking at it from an interdisciplinary perspective. What are ways in which law intersects with economics, which intersects within sociology, which intersects within housing policy? It really looks at it all in a very holistic manner and calls for more critical thought and more critical in-depth dives into what is actually happening.
As an educator, I can take it even to the very basic level of what the state of Indiana has just gone through. Kudos to the teachers of Indiana. We fought a bill called HB 1134, and basically it was centered around critical race theory. But what it was doing was basically they were trying to silence teachers as far as teaching history, science, even what I teach, education professions. And basically what they wanted us to do is they wanted us to just kind of teach the surface. So for instance, with slavery, they just wanted us to give the facts. So therefore, if the children wanted to have a discussion, we couldn't talk about it. We just had to teach the facts. If we got into, evolution, with science, we just had to teach the basics. But if the children had questions, we couldn't answer those questions. Even what I teach is, being an education profession teacher, I teach all the way from the human anatomy to 18 years old. So therefore, that would have stopped me from even saying how conception happens, or even just saying there's a difference between a male and a female anatomy. So they really tried to silence our voice as far as what we could actually teach. Even to the point where they wanted parents to approve our lesson plans and take their children out of the classroom if we were teaching something that the parents didn't approve of, that either the parents could say, no, I don't want my child in the classroom when that's being taught, or they could just say, well, no, we just don't want that taught at all. And then they also tried to put in place where teachers would be penalized if we were caught having discussion with children about, certain topics. So they really took it like from just being a race issue to like all the way to just saying, okay, you can't touch on certain things at all. So they really tried to silence us, but luckily we won. We got the House bill thrown out and we had the Senate bill thrown out. So we were one of the states that actually fought our government during the legislative session on not passing those bills.
Well, congratulations on that. And thank you for giving that. I want to stay with you very quickly on that, because I think it was just today I read on CNN.com about another state that just recently passed something about not being able to talk about race at all in classrooms. Mm-hmm. But as it relates to that, like as a teacher, and I'm not exactly sure what, course you actually teach your elementary school age children. But, we talk about often, when it comes to Black History Month, like how do you even have that conversation if you're talking about the history of the country? How can you even how do you address that? Can you expand a little bit on how you are addressing?
Like for me, like personally, like luckily for me, like I've taught elementary, middle school, and now I'm in high school. But as when you're teaching things like, I would say, unfortunately, because there's not a lot of African-American teachers in elementary, middle school, or high school. So then when we do bring in that topic and we do try to educate the kids, we bring it in. And some of those topics, I mean, depending on the classes, depending on the group of children, they want to know. They want to know. They want to see what, if they hear lynching, well, what is lynching? They want to see, okay, well, what does that look like? Okay, so why did they lynch them?
Right.
Why did they burn them? I mean, so those are the questions that, as a teacher, we address those. If the children start asking, we address those. But what our senators and congressmen were trying to do, and I should really say the Republicans, because that's who we really were fighting against.
Right.
They didn't want us to say anything. And it's like, well, how can you tell us if we bring up a topic and it's in the books? How do you tell us that we can't answer questions?
Right.
Because children are curious. They want to know. They want to know, what does that mean? What does that look like? So how do we not tell them that? How do we not tell them, why, we had our, like our Jackie Robinsons, why, how can you tell us that we can't tell them what happened? You just want us to say, oh, well, he's the first Negro to play baseball. That's all you want us to say. But kids want to know why. Because today they watch sports. All they see is athletes of color.
Right.
So they can't imagine that no athletes of colors could play.
Right.
There's things that we had to fight to say, you got to let us talk to the kids. You can't just tell us that we can't talk to them, because they want to know.
Right. Well, we're already starting to get questions in, but this one was directly at you, but Tamika and Kalila, you all can weigh in on this as well. But the question was, has there been impacts to the children and the teachers around it so far?
It's I would say, talking to colleagues in other states, they're really disturbed. And so we have, as the state of Indiana, we have joined other school organizations in other states with protesting with them, standing in solidarity, because we've shared like our videos and things that we've had, because for us, we did, luckily we had children, and we had children, we had parents, we had teachers who spoke on the floor opposing this. But sometimes even just to hear the voices of the children, they even took it a step further, that they even took race out of it. They was like, if I can't talk to my teacher, who can I talk to?
Right.
I mean, they took it all the way, and that was powerful, that children came in and said, well, let's just take our race. So you're going to tell me I just can't talk to my teacher at all if there's a problem, or if I'm going through something, if, I may need somebody to talk to. And so just to hear that from children, that they weren't even thinking about race. They were just like, I can't talk to my teacher.
Right.
Who else talk to if I can't talk to my parents? So it even just took it to a whole nother level, that we were like, okay, so now you got to look at it as these babies, they need somebody.
Right. Kalila or Tamika?
I would just think about this from the perspective of who we are as a country, who we say we are,
yes,
and who we say we want to be. We are right now watching in the US a war and invasion of Ukraine. We are sending billions of dollars. We are putting the lives of American people at risk, because we believe that democracy is at risk in Ukraine, and by extension, for the rest of the world. What is central for democracy to flourish is knowledge, education, and freedom.
Yes.
And to say that in this country, we are willing to handicap our children and not allow them to have access to information, and by extension, access to freedom, because we don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean, not just for us today, but for those yet to come?
Mm-hmm.
And while Ms. Angie talked about, the impact of the K through 12 space, we're dealing with this in the collegiate space as well, where people are afraid to, Lee and I were talking before, as my down home folks say, people are afraid to call a thing a thing.
Right.
Sometimes that's what you have to do.
Right.
So in this last 2 years, our young people have endured a devastating pandemic and uprisings over racial justice. So it's no surprise that now that attack.
Right.
So if you can't know yourself, know this country, and not just the bad parts, but the things that makes it beautiful, because we can overcome and come through pain. We're not really educating people. We're trying to indoctrinate people by not giving them access to freedom.
Yes. Yes. So that the education is the freedom that you
Education is the freedom. And if anyone thinks that teachers are indoctrinating kids or educators are indoctrinating, I'm sure my colleagues here will tell you, I can't always convince my students to do the reading and do their homework.
Right.
I certainly can't convince them to totally change what they are led to believe. And so as adults, we have to get out of the way and listen to these young people who are saying, I need something, I need stability and an anchor, because it's literally life and death and freedom for them.
Tamika?
Yes. So I think that at the very root of it, we also have to make sure that we understand that they're purposefully conflating two very different things. So they are using critical race theory, as Lee said, the boogeyman. It's the catch-all phrase for anything that is telling truth and accurate historical evidence or accurate information, to where anything that is not giving this rosy picture of things, then that is critical race theory. I mean, we saw with the 1619 Project, all of the attacks that were within that. And even from the White House, right after the 1619 Project came out, then President Trump released the 1776 Commission, to where it's just like, no, we're going to teach our kids to be proud of America. And as my colleague just said, it's not saying don't be proud of how far we come, but we need to actually analyze what it is that we did and give accurate pick trails and ideas of what occurred, so we don't return to it. Because even as we think about our portrayals of history, of even slavery and stuff, people think about it as just labor. Very few people talk about slave breeding and how mortgages were backed on the bodies of slaves. Very few people talk about the cadaver slave trade, which is why even after slaves were deceased, their bodies were still bought and sold along the rivers, to where this stuff is important, to where if we're going to talk about, all of these other places and where America is great, we can be great, but we need to reckon with what these things are and think about historical accuracy and think about what are the lessons we can learn. And you can't do that if you just give it a broad stroking, everything was great, and we all sing Kumbaya now. So I think that the kids are being impacted because they're also believing that everything is just this, and they're not even learning critical race theory, which is really looking at laws and institutions, as we've pointed out. They're just not even getting any accurate portrayals. So they are definitely hurting. And as a country, we are stifling ourselves quite a bit by not giving that education and knowledge.
And I will say, on a high school level, they do get some of that, because as them being teenagers, like I've said before, they ask questions. They want to know, and they just want to know. So they do get a chance to get into those conversations with their teachers. And it's all kind of teachers. I mean, I can talk about so many different conversations I've had just on, where the basis of how we all look. So why do we look a certain way? Like, like our kids, like I've talked about my background, and I brought into slavery, because I get questions all the time, like, well, Miss Hood, are you mixed? Well, technically, no, but yes. So I have to explain my background, and, which it all started with slavery.
Yes, yes, yes. That we'll get to the 1619 project in our next question, but in some of the research that I've done around this topic too, we hear about German children. And
Mhm.
I've been to Berlin, but they're taught what the Holocaust was. They were taught what Nazi Germany was and how the Berlin Wall came down. And
Mhm.
just casually walking through Berlin, you actually see the entire wall is actually dedicated as you're walking along as a living memorial or museum to that situation. And those kids are taught that so that they know, as you said, Ms. Hood, not to repeat it. Or
Mhm.
said that, I think, not to repeat the past. And so that education is the freedom, and it really does empower you as opposed to making you feel like you're down on your country because we've overcome that. Now, do we have a lot more to do? Yes, but we came from that, selling cadaver bodies down the rivers, so that's something to think about as well. All right. So the next question we'll go into is, we know that the 1619 project was authored by your fellow thought leader, New York Times bestseller and columnist, Nicole Hannah-Jones. And due to the popularity of that book, she was rescinded an offer for tenureship at UNC Chapel Hill. So what role does CRT play in education today? I think that we're kind of answering that question a little bit. I wrote this out early, before we got to this and we started having the conversation. But as Ms. Hood and Tamika, as you're dealing with kids on a daily basis in your classes, the difference between actual teaching history, American history, and actual critical race theory. We know that those two are not happening at the same time, but how are there ways for you to be able to teach our rich history from our very broad lens?
So I'm quite fortunate to where I am one of the associate deans of our honors college, to where in our freshman seminar, I don't teach a lot anymore for that reason, but in our honors freshman seminar, which is our first year seminal course, which I do get an opportunity to teach. I actually do teach it. I teach them, here's what intersectionality is, here's what critical race theory is. And I take those moments to really talk about, hey, you're hearing all of this stuff. Let's actually talk about what it is, what the foundations are, how does it work, and what it's not. So I do point to some of the boogeyman stuff that's there when people say, like, it's just to make white kids feel bad about themselves. Like, no, it's not. And it's really not about trying to up in society and then replace the dominant with or the colonizers with the people who were colonized, really. To where it really is going and just understanding, how do we fix these things? How do we look at, power dynamics and cultural structures? And how do we figure out ways in which to upend those power dynamics, not just to replicate them by displacing them, but really to change the very structure that undergirds our politics, our laws, our culture, and just figure out ways to level the playing field. So it's really understanding the differences between equity, equality, justice, all of those things. So that's where I spend a lot of time really helping not just my students, also my colleagues, because there are definitely colleagues who question it, to where you brought up, Nicole Hannah-Jones's tenure decision being rescinded, which she made the right choice by deciding not to play that game and going somewhere else where her work is celebrated. But there are hit lists to where there's entire websites and stuff like, here are the campuses that teach critical race theory and stuff, to where here are the professors that are, and the harassment online for those things and that type of stuff. Like, that definitely occurs, but that doesn't mean that you stop speaking truth to power. It doesn't mean that you don't continue teaching what it actually is, because the more people push back, the more resistance to it, the more important it is. Why are they trying to ban your knowledge if it is so harmless, or if it's so bad, those things? Why don't they want you to learn it? To where I challenge my students and the scholars that I work with to really think beyond, why is that purposefully being taught that way? Why are things purposely left out of the conversation, and who benefits from those decisions?
Mm-hmm. So,
the way and it's kind of I would say just recently, just like I said, we're dealing with this congressmen and senators. To be honest, I would say that we taught them more then we were actually like having to, I would say, I was proud of our kids, because I was proud of our children. I was proud of a lot of teachers that spoke up, because actually we were giving them a lesson on, this is not critical race theory. It's not to make, people feel bad. It's not to make people feel inferior. It's more of, this is our foundation. This is the foundation of this country. A lot of the events in history, this is how this country was built. And it's not that it's to make anybody feel bad. It's to just know your history, know where you live, know what happened. Is there some good, bad, and ugly? Absolutely. But it still needs to be known. It's not that we can hide, because we need to know these things. And, for me, even though I teach in the North, I have Southern roots. So, luckily, like as for myself as an adult, I was taught the good, bad, and ugly. I still can go to my mother's hometown and I can see the good, bad, and ugly. I know who my slave owners were. It's just simple things. It doesn't make me feel different or make me feel like I should feel bad or I should be mad. It's just, it's history. It's what needs to be known. And it makes everybody, everything that has happened, it's just the basics of, you need to know who you are.
Yeah.
And, hey,
yeah.
You have to know it's okay. So, and it can be very innocent, but what has happened, unfortunately, is everybody's making it like, oh, it's just so horrible, like one of the other panelists said, it's the boogeyman. No, it's not the boogeyman. It's just truth.
Right. Before we went live, Kalila and I were talking about how we, our people come from the same region of Virginia. And my father's from Smith County. My last name is Smith. So that there's we actually have a whole history book of the Black people who were in Smith County. And that was my father's family, who built that town and built the local school for Black children to go to, built the Black church that was there, all of those things. So they were very involved in what was going on, but I wouldn't know that, if that wasn't recorded in history. So your history actually gives you a sense of belonging to the country that you're in, so I just think that it's very important. So we're going to get to some of those questions as well as we move on, but I'm loving how this conversation is going. So thank you all. We have a question that's coming here and says, what are some of the ways that I can support CRT among colleagues in a corporate environment?
So I would probably approach the question a little differently. Rather than supporting critical race theory, how do we support having honest conversations in the corporate environment? How do we create corporate workspaces or any kind of workspace where people can show up in their full selves and not be tolerated, but be accepted and affirmed as such? So just as, now every corporation wants to put up a banner about Juneteenth, or they want to put up a banner around Asian American Pacific Islander History Month or Pride Month, or whatever the other identity-based groups are there.
Yes.
That is a way of saying, why do we need that? Because for so long, we have denied the presence of people around us. For so long, people coming from certain Asian countries were denied US citizenship. This didn't go away in the 1880s. This changed in the lifetime of many of us. I'm gonna speak for myself because I think we're probably a little older, in our lifetime, in our history. And that's why we shared. And that's why our corporate spaces need to understand. It's not about whether you call someone a derogatory term. It's about, if you are in a corporate environment where you have the opportunity to influence hiring, why does it make a difference how you perceive my resume if you see my Arabic first name versus if I just put my initials and then you make adjustments?
Yes.
Why does it show up in the ways that you interact with your customers and with your clients and how you see value? So that's about approaching and supporting a cultural awareness and a cultural humility that isn't tied to a particular theory devoid of context. That's where I think we say to people, You can keep your hashtags and your banners and your sort of, ego-driven displays of support.
Yes.
Show me who's in your C-suite.
Yep.
That's how we support it.
Yeah, it's so funny. I literally was in the office today and we had an all hands, and I raised that question. We're looking to expand and grow our particular department by 150 people by the end of the year. And the question I asked was, what are we doing to make sure that we're opening some of these roles to folks that are from underrepresented communities? We got to make sure that we're actively trying to find a way for them to get in here to these jobs.
And for them to stay there. Because that retention piece, as it relates to the things that critical race theory raises about all the focus on recruitment, and then not looking at the structures within these places that limit promotion and often reward poor behavior.
Absolutely.
That's where educating our young people as the entrepreneurs and leaders helps us create that shift.
Yeah.
And we've been working on that even as educators, unfortunately, even in the teachers union. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we've been dealing with getting more minorities involved. Mm-hmm. And I know I'm one of the minorities that they ask me to do stuff and I say yes. And there's other teachers of color who are like, well, Miss Hood, you're so busy. You stay so busy in the union. I was like, and you need to also. I said, because right now, I said, take a bit. I said, we're in a prime position. They want us. And not only do they want us, they need us. Yeah. Because the world is changing too fast for them to handle. Yeah. I said, so they need us to be front and center to help them understand some things, because now, even in the world of education, even in this teachers union, they're facing a lot of different challenges that they've never faced before. So they need teachers of color to step up. So we've been really working on that, on getting teachers of color, and not just African Americans. I mean, we're getting our Indian teachers, Hispanic. We've been making a big push for our Black male teachers. We're like, come on, we need y'all to be in leadership roles. We need y'all to step up. So we've been really pushing them for that. And, because we have in the past, we have had situations where it's only a handful of us and we're made to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. There's a lot of conversation around that, representation matters. And so when you see someone that, as a young kid, I was very blessed to have lots of African-American teachers, but I didn't have very many Black men, teachers. And so more Black male teachers is going to be really, really important. I know, of course, as, members of Cap Office High, we really do a lot of that mentorship with young Black men, giving them those good role models to be able to see, how do I tie a tie? How do I, put a corsage on a young lady's, dress when I want to take her to the prom, or whatever it is? Those things you don't even realize how those things affect them coming up. So that's another story. We can come back for another panel on that. But and we will get into politics shortly. But I did have a question. I'm sorry if that I'm looking down, but I'm getting questions from all over the place. There was a question that came in that said, what do you feel about the media's play in steering the decision-making on this narrative? So I think that we can start to delve into that as we start to then move into the politics and how this narrative is being sort of made into the boogeyman that we're talking about. But the media does have a lot to do with that. And it frustrates me so much because I'm a politics junkie and I'm always watching all the different shows. I even watch Fox News because I want to see what they're talking about. I want to get a difference of opinion. But when I hear them talking about it, it frustrates me when the pundits just won't say, like we're saying on this panel, what is critical race theory? Like, define it. Like, stop playing around with it and making it continue to be this boogeyman so that people can come on ad nauseum 24/7, show after show, to talk about this issue when it really isn't an issue. So does anyone want to take that on for me?
Yeah, so I think that it's very important. And you saying, like, why won't they just ask it? It's purposeful to where I will not say that every single person who does this knows, but I certainly think that there are definitely a lot of them that do. They understand that they are perpetuating a falsehood and are helping to create this narrative. And they just keep repeating it enough times to where it's going to be believed. And like I said, I'm not going to say all, because there's definitely a few that don't know. They're hearing it. They're getting their text from whoever it is that their writers are, but they're appealing to a certain subset of their audience. So they're thinking about how can we frame this in ways that can scare people to where they keep tuning into our network, to where they keep listening to what it is that we have to say about it, as opposed to others, to where we are the ones that are telling you the truth. Everybody else is telling you lies, to where it is a very purposeful tactic. But media, responsible media, goes deeper into it. Responsible journalism asks those questions and finds out what's there. Talk to the actual experts, have experts on those panels. And Kalila and I have both done that in lots of ways, in lots of different spaces, to where there are definitely some people who are doing the responsible work and are asking for people to really do that work for them and help them explain it to their audiences and help them to understand it as well. But yes, there are definitely some that purposefully conflated and purposefully lie to their audiences, unfortunately.
I think we have an obligation to be better advocates. Those of us who are in positions to do that, whether it's through fraternal organizations, civic organizations, unionized organizations, and communities, you have the ability to, as John Hope Franklin said, to tell the unvarnished truth. And to make sure that you're pushing back against that. And one of those spaces where we can do that, particularly we think about young people, how they get access to news, is through social media. Think about all the misinformation and disinformation that circulated around COVID, and how many people were vulnerable because they believed somebody's uncle, who all of a sudden became a medical expert, a constitutional law scholar, and a minister, and folks were dying. So how do we support the media that comes from our community, whether that's, shameless plug, is why I have a radio show and podcast, because I want to use this platform to help people understand we can celebrate all these wonderful things. Ask yourself why Brittany Griner, no one's talking about the fact that this Black queer woman has been kept over in Russia, and no one is advocating on the scale that we would see if it were a different player. That's how we use our sources, our platform, to push back to say critical race theory isn't about feeling bad. But if you can fight to keep a Confederate statue in 2022 because that's your reverence for history, then you don't get to tell me to just get over my history. That's how we have the obligation, these kinds of forums, and why I'm grateful to the Brooklyn, Long Island chapter for saying, how do we use technology for good?
Yes.
And not just to make money for other folks.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That was almost, I want to pass the plate for that. Well, and it's funny because we're getting some questions that are coming in, and even our audience, I think, is still even kind of confused on the difference between CRT and actual American history. So one of the questions that actually came in, which I think is being answered, and this is no, stain, because we want the questions to come in. So I'm not, demeaning anybody that's asking the question, but it says, how does it make you feel as an educator? When school boards prohibit each student, teaching students about critical race theory? So it's not being taught, but we've already started, that narrative is out there. And so we're conflating actual American history with critical race theory, like knowing that it is not being taught in schools and that this term has been put out there. So maybe, Angie, if you want to take that a little bit, that question again was, how does it make you feel as an educator when school boards prohibit you from teaching students about critical race theory, but it's not really critical race theory?
I'm going to go ahead and just be a little inappropriate, mad as hell. Because you can't tell me what to teach. Because first of all, you all voted on everything that we're teaching right now. So why are you backpedaling, telling us that we can't teach it? You approved it. You said we could teach it. Actually, you told us we had to teach it, and we have to be evaluated on it. So don't backpedal now. because you have a handful of parents who are angry because they don't understand critical race theory, or you have a politician who is, calling the school board out about, certain topics that are going on, centered around critical race theory. So it's like, you can't tell me, almost like you can't tell me what to do. And I think I have that more spirit because I have been teaching 24 years and I've taught, from elementary and now all the way up to high school. So I'm like, yeah, you can't tell me what to do because you approved this. And some of this stuff you approved it even before I became an educator. So I'm going to teach it. I'm going to do what I need to do. I will say, luckily, I will say for the state of, well, I won't say the state of Indiana. I will say the city of Indianapolis. All of our school district school boards, which we have been blessed with, all of them supported us. All of us supported us with teaching critical race theory. And they told us that they will support their teachers and they will not let us be silenced. So that was, I will say that was a good note for the city of Indianapolis. So they stood with us in solidarity saying, no, you're going to leave our teachers alone.
Yeah. And I can tell that this is a very hot topic because the questions are coming in fast and furious now. And because you are a teacher of young children right now, a lot of these questions are coming at you, Angie. One of them is, how do you manage resistance from parents who are reluctant to embrace concepts of CRT?
Usually what happens when if there is, I will say I'm in one of the school districts that we don't have a resistance. We do have a school system that had a major resistance with not teachers, but parents protesting. They even had somebody who they had hired to teach critical race theory to their teachers, to staff members. And unfortunately, they had to let that person go because the parents protested so much against this person being in this position and being in the school district. So it was a big ordeal, as far as, over a position that nobody even wanted to even have a discussion about. And it was really the parents in this particular district didn't want to have a discussion about it. And unfortunately, they were of the other race, and their attitude was, well, you're going to make my kids feel bad about history, and you're going to make them feel bad if you teach them this, and you're going to make them, feel bad for who they are. And it's like, no, that's not what this is about. That's not what we're doing.
Right.
So really with that, it's been a lot of educating. It's just been a lot of educating. It's been a lot of answering questions. And a lot of the school districts, I'm fortunate enough that I don't have that issue, but in some of the other school districts, it has been very challenging for teachers to deal with.
I was having this conversation with my mom and my dad, and they were saying like, I don't remember. I mean, parents have always had the right to come into schools and see what was going on. It was called the PTA. I remember I used to sit, on pins and needles when it was parent teacher conference, just to make sure that when my parents got home that, I wasn't getting in trouble for talking too much in class or whatever it was. But I do remember my parents being very involved in my education and wanting to know how I was doing and what was being taught, but not to the level that it is now. It's like it has become so political at this level. Is that there's something else going on there? It has politics invaded even. Well, yeah, clearly it has. We're going to move into that next section now, talking about politics invading our education system. But Kalila, do you want to talk about that at all?
I mean, I'm nodding along because, again, this isn't limited to the K through 12 space.
Right.
This is happening in colleges and universities across the space of higher education. We used to joke and call it helicopter parenting. And we would see it because rather than teaching our children to be advocates for themselves, to be independent thinkers, to be able to engage difference from a place of civility and mutual respect, Now it is, I have heard something that I don't like, and I need you to punish that person and penalize that person.
Mhm.
And that's a problem. You know, when I was listening to you talk about, oh, you're going to make kids feel bad to learn this history. Again, I grew up in Virginia. We had to go visit Monticello as a part of our 6th grade history curriculum. I don't think anyone ever asked me, do you feel bad that as a part of this tour, you had to go see Thomas Jefferson's bedroom? No one ever asked me, did you feel bad when you realized that there was a stairway that led from his bedroom to the quarters where Sally Hemings slept, this enslaved woman who was his wife's half-sister? No one ever asked how we felt about that, being on a space that we knew that the soil was soaked in the blood and tears of our ancestors. And instead, what it made me do is realize there are people who never imagined me in this space. And how do I take that and continue to show up in spaces that you don't expect me to be? So I'll give you one other example, because I know we're going into the political part of this. You know, working in higher education, when I was a high school student, a guidance counselor told me that I wasn't serious enough for college and that she thought I should take up a trade because I wasn't really college material. And I believed her, because I was a first generation college kid. And if the guidance counselor says it, it must be true. But it was that word getting back to my mother, and my mother showing up to school to say, how dare you?
Right.
And I'm now in a position where, as a full professor, less than 5% of full professors in this country are women of color. Less than 5%. So I know I show up every day in my full self with people questioning that. And before I open my mouth, there is the assumption, and Tamika, I know you can relate to this. There's this assumption that my perspective and my ideology will be a particular way, and they know nothing about me. So that politicization that we see around critical race theory, around social and emotional wellness, to say that our kids are dealing with not post-traumatic stress, but perpetual traumatic stress. And that if we don't do something to disrupt that, we are creating a nation of people who cannot function. And that's where the political piece of this, the economic incentive, because who benefits from ignorance? Those who will take your freedom and use it against you.
Right.
That's where we are as a nation.
Thank you for that. Tamika, do you want to add anything to that before we move on to the politics of it? Oh.
I think my colleague summed it up perfectly.
Great. All right. So as it relates to politics, we have seen so many state legislatures and the Republican Party seize onto the CRT boogeyman trope, pushing the narrative around states' rights. Glenn Youngkin, the now governor of Virginia, successfully ran on that platform, and he won. That win put a flame under the other states that we see now, and the candidates' campaigns who are also doing the same. So when did CRT become this political football, and are we seemingly losing that game?
It's hard to point to the exact moment that it did. I would say that the roots of that set the stage for a lot of this is when the fights over textbooks started. So this was decades ago, to where in textbooks, even mentioning slavery, there are definitely some states, I'll use Texas, for instance, to where slavery is described as voluntary agricultural immigration. I think that was one of the textbooks that was there, to where this set the stage to where people were advocating for, let's reword these things and stuff. And it's kind of set the stage for, let's see how far we can push this narrative. Let's see how far we can push, the changes that we want to see. And again, using Texas as an example, we're seeing, the governor attacking, on the higher ed scale, the governor saying, like, anyone who teaches critical race theory should lose their tenure. And we're also seeing that echoed in Florida and other spaces, to where there's definitely, as it's building momentum and as it's resonating with voters to their bases and stuff, it's starting to be more widespread. And as you're seeing it win, so once Florida passed their banning of critical race theory, that's when you saw other states popping up with very similar bills. You saw Wisconsin a few years ago, this actually failed to where they wanted, you couldn't even say certain words. And some of the words were like very ambiguous, not ambiguous, but like things like gender, sex, those types of things were being banned from teaching. This bill did fail, but you're starting to see a lot more creativity behind these think tanks that are really putting out these bills. It's not just the politicians and stuff that are crafting them. They're actual think tanks of researchers and stuff that are figuring out, how can we craft this in such a way that is going to pass and is going to push it just a little bit further to where eventually we can control everything. And as Kalila said, once they control the narrative and once they control it, who benefits from it?
Yeah, I've often said that I think that a lot of this, a narrative that's being, it's almost like they want to keep some of their constituents in the dark. The more educated you are, as Kalila said, the more freedom you have. And so I think that was recently they paid some Fox News viewers to watch CNN. And, when they did, they're all of a sudden, when they took the poll again, then their minds changed about how they felt about a lot of social issues that are being pushed right now. And so I think that it has a way of keeping people in the dark and people angry about things that they don't even understand. And so I just think that that's where a lot of this, disinformation or misinformation is coming from. Anyone want to add on to that at all?
I want to say Tamika's absolutely right. And that's how we in Indiana actually got them, because they didn't expect us to read and dissect that law.
Right.
They did not expect us to dissect it like we did, because things did come up like sex, gender. They even tried to attack the public libraries, wanted to have certain books removed. And it was like, really? So the biggest thing, that they did not expect. And I always say my favorite line, I always tell my kids, reading is fundamental. They really did not expect for the educators to sit down and dissect that law, because it went from like 200 pages to like 34 pages. And they still thought, okay, so we took some of this stuff out, so the teachers will support. And we were like, no. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You still have language in there that no. So we don't agree, and you keep trying to gaslight it, and it's not working. Yeah. So, we have had a lot of states actually they watched us. And so they have been asking for support. So even for the next year, like, okay, so how do we help? How do we defeat this? Like you all did. Because we were like, we already know that it's coming back around. So we know the next year that we're going to go through the same fight, because it's our, talk. There's, people behind the scenes. Some of the news media has been on our side. So we kind of been finding out information. So, yeah, so we already know that, we have an uphill battle again next year, but we're ready.
Yeah, and I didn't dive too deeply into like the recent bill that DeSantis just passed in Florida about even critical race theory showing up in math. I'm like, how? Like, where is that happening? So it really is like they're just tagging onto it just to continue to make it a hot button so that they can drive voters to the polls. I believe that's where that political slant is coming from. But there was a question that did come in, and I think that we're kind of answering it now, but it says, what do you think the first step is in changing the mind of politicians who are against CRT being taught in schools across the USA? And I think this forum here is one of the reasons why we decided to do this, but so that we can educate our constituents around it. Because I do think that even among our people, our Black and brown people, we are falling for the okie doke as well. When you're constantly bombarded, in the media about what CRT is and not knowing the difference, that's one of the reasons why we do this. But if you do want to take a stab at that, what do you think are some of the steps that we can take to change in the mind of maybe politicians or just even constituents around it?
I would say we could probably be most effective in addressing the constituents and sharing that education and that very basic knowledge. Lee, you mentioned that you're a political nerd, a political junkie. I'm a lifelong nerd. I'm a political scientist. I would be derelict in my duties as a political scientist not to remind people that for all the excitement in 2020, 2022 will be an even more critical election year. 469 members of the United States Congress are up for election this year. Governors in key states are up for election this year. Those will be people who not just decide about curriculum and whether Angie Hood can do the job that she has trained to do and that she has given her life work to do when she could have done something else, making a whole lot more money with less headaches. So I first want to applaud you, because to be a teacher is not easy, and it is the most important job in this country. And so I want to acknowledge that. But if we want to support that work, then we elect people who, just because you look like me doesn't mean you are for me. And so we elect people who value our children and value our community and don't just show up around election time.
Right.
We change that thinking by asking people the difficult questions, demanding realistic answers. And if they don't have answers, they don't deserve our votes, because they will decide whether we will continue to see the erosion of voting rights in this country. All the people who showed up to John Lewis's funeral and then went to work that next week in Congress and worked to erode the very thing that he suffered a fractured skull for. Yeah. That's how we change it, by taking our power as voters. And for those who are not eligible to vote because of other archaic laws laced with racism, for those of us who are eligible, we have an obligation to do that for the children today and those yet to come. I'm less worried about changing hearts and more focused on changing outcomes. We need more conversation, more targeted voter registration, voter empowerment, and outreach so that we collectively hold people accountable.
The only thing that I would add to that, because I think that that's perfectly said, the only thing that I would add is organizing. Is thinking about ways in which you can organize and do things to get people out. So if it is the voter registration drives, if it is carpooling, if it is educating and having forums like this one. So I do echo Kalila in thanking the Brooklyn Long Island chapter for having it tonight and inviting us to speak on it. But there's so much that can be done, and people always wait for someone else to do it. But there's so many little things that we can organize and coalition bill and make sure that people are getting out there to where anyone who is eligible can get to the voting polls, making sure that they have their proper IDs, make sure that they know whatever the laws are of those spaces, making sure that they're on the rolls and haven't been purged from those rolls. There are so many little things that add up and have real impacts in the outcome.
Great. Anything to add there, Angie, at all? Or
no, I want to say thank you for, acknowledging me for being an educator. And I will say, how we, do organizing and everything. That's the one push that we do with our high school kids. We do get them to vote, and we get them to become registered voters. So we actually have, when it's time for them to register to vote, if they're old enough to vote, we actually have people who come in and they sit in the cafeteria during their lunch periods so they can make an easy way for them to register to vote. And then our history teachers actually make sure the kids, if they're eligible, that they register them to vote.
Nice. All right. Well, we're going to start to, come down on the lower end of wrapping this out tonight. So now that we understand what critical race theory is and what it isn't, where it's actually being taught and why. Can you all as educators dissect what should be taught to school-age children about race and racial constructs, or if that has a place in classrooms at all up to a certain age?
Well, I'm definitely one of those people who would say we need to teach age-appropriate things on all levels, where I believe in age-appropriate sex education that starts in kindergarten, to where the more education people have, the more knowledge they have, the more we can fight ignorance. So I believe that it starts at the very early stages. As Kalila shared her experiences of, when she was in school having to go to Monticello. I'm from Louisiana, to where there were regularly trips to plantations and those types of things. If those things can happen in elementary school, then we can have real conversations at the elementary school level about these issues, about history, making it appropriate. Of course, we don't want to give the kids nightmares, but certainly have appropriate conversations and start educating them about the truth, the history, and how we can overcome these structures.
And I totally agree. Because I know, like, me teaching different levels. I taught my first graders, about slavery. When I taught first grade, and I gave them, just the basic, just enough to know, this is what it is, this is what it means. And like you said, even like sex ed, because they already know their anatomy. They just may have some other questions that you're like, oh, okay, maybe just a little bit, or maybe I can discuss a little bit, or even, maybe, some questions I get, if the questions for me are too deep, I tell them, go home and ask your parents. So it's kind of like I'm making the parents talk to them too, because they need to, if they're asking me the questions, I'm like, I was like, that's not quite my place. So I need you to go home and ask your parents. But yeah, I think we should, start it early and all the way up to even the grade level I teach now, because a lot of kids, they have no idea, or they find out about things. And so then they're curious. And with my Southern roots, I'm from, my mom is from Marion, Alabama, which is 45 minutes from Selma. So, I've been in Selma, I've been in Marion, I've been on I've been to the plantation houses. Like I said, even my background, I've shared my background with my kids that, that I'm French and Irish, and that my French ancestors were my slave owners, and my Irish ancestors were the ones who freed us from slavery. So, I share those things, with them, it just depends on the age group you're teaching, but, it's never too early to start teaching them, about, different things with, history, sex, politics, it's never too early to start teaching them.
Yeah. And again, that's why I say that, we spend so much time with we call them Kappa leaguers, but they're our school age children that we guide throughout their formative years, and giving them, guidance from a Black male perspective. And I remember my mother is a legal librarian, and fun for me, or I shouldn't say it was punishment, but it was like, during the summer, I had to make sure that I wrote a book report on something. And at the end of the week, I had to give that book report to her to let her know that I had learned something throughout the years. I also have 2 older sisters. And I remember going to diving off into sex education. But I remember going into their rooms, and my mother had drawn full diagrams of their bodies on a large piece of paper, and actually telling them what parts of their bodies were what, with the real name, not, these little kind of like fake names or whatever it was, to educate them on what it was that their body does and how it works. So I just think that in general, education is such a strong tool for children, even at a young age. It gives them a much more autonomy about their selves, and how they show up in the classroom, how they show up in the world. It doesn't allow them to be taken advantage of or anything like that. So I just wanted to add that there too. It's just super, super important for education to start at a very young age, depending on how much children can take in. So
can I just add really quickly to that? I think we have to remind ourselves that children are people. They're not little people, they are people.
Right.
And they are people who are so much more capable than I think adults give them credit for.
Mm-hmm.
And too often as adults, we allow our fears and our limitations to get in the way of them exploring their life, the things that they believe in, their autonomy. And I think we need to lean into that, so that when young people are asking questions, listen, learn from them, let them guide us. They are more aware of the world and what's happening and what's right, what's wrong, who means them good, who means them harm, than I think we give them credit for. And those kinds of mentoring experiences My experience has been sometimes when I think I am mentoring the young person, they're really mentoring me. Because they're saying, well, that's kind of old. That's a little boomerish. We do this way now.
Right, right.
And that kind of intergenerational learning, especially in our communities, as our elders are leaving us, is so key to keep that going so that they know you are made for excellence. You come from a people of tremendous accomplishment and achievement. You can't let the world define you. And we owe it to them to respect them as people.
Amen to that. All right. Well, we are definitely coming up on the last 15 minutes. So I'm huge on takeaways around forums like this. So as it relates to education, what are the top 3 things we want to impart to our listening audience tonight around critical race theory and how we want to move forward? I'll let Tamika kick that off, or do you need more time to think about it?
I knew you were going to do that. Top 3 takeaways. One is to understand that the media is painting it inappropriately, and to really take the time to do more research, go deeper. Don't just let what we've told you be the end of it, but seek out real information. So don't just stop at the websites, do a Google search, go to Google Scholar. Let's see what the scholars are actually writing about this and really understanding what peer-reviewed academic research looks like and why that's so critical to think about that review process. So the first thing is to know that that's not an accurate portrayal. The second thing is the importance of really knowing our history and really knowing how to frame that history and those conversations to whether it is talking to young children or if it's talking to elders, what are ways in which we are also a part of imparting that knowledge and sharing that, because the people that are in your lives are going to trust you. You have certain validity with them that someone else is not, to where they're listening to you, they trust you. So give accurate information when you're sharing it. Don't just click the like or the reshare buttons when you're in social media just because you like the headlines. Actually read what's there and make sure that it's accurate. And then the last thing is that my takeaway from all of this is that we really need to understand how the importance of not just voting for federal elections, but also knowing about local and state elections, because those impact us even more than federal elections, and really getting the people in our lives to see the importance of researching and knowing what candidates actually stand for and not just what they say. Not just the people who show up to the church who's never been there in your community ever before. Know what are their actual voting records, what are their policies, what are the things that they've done, and if they are a new candidate, what are the platforms and the policy planks that they do have. So really getting people to dig deeper into those local and state elections and then showing up to vote, because those are even more critical than the federal.
Thank you. Angie?
I agree with a couple of things that Tamika actually said. Know the history. Know your history. Learn the history. So you have a better understanding of what it actually means. As far as with the voting and the elections, yes, please get out there and vote for every election. Don't just wait for it because, okay, we need a new president or we're getting ready to vote for a president. You need to vote for everybody. And, yes, know what those politicians and what those candidates stand for. I mean, don't just watch the commercials and say, oh, I'm sick of looking at the commercials. Really find out, like, what do they stand for? What do they believe? And, then my last thing I would say is really try to know the laws, know what is being passed in the Senate and the House and how they can affect your life. How can they affect you? Because they're going to be there until somebody challenges it and, gets it changed.
Thank you. And then Kalila, we'll let you close it out for us.
I mean, it's hard to follow these two women. I will just say this, everything that they said, I agree with, especially the idea of getting involved. I think when we talk about this work, we often talk about other people and what other people need to do and what we want to see other people change. This process has to start with us as individuals, in our families, in our spaces, in our communities. We should celebrate Ketanji Brown Jackson being the first Black woman to serve on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
But we also have to acknowledge Constance Baker Motley, who made that possible.
Yes.
And for me, when I think of the three takeaways that brings all of this together, I would say first, you have to know yourself. And that means going beyond the history that you know right now and digging deeper and digging broadly so that we can really do that. The second is to challenge yourself, to sometimes step out of the comfort of, we're in the right organizations, we had the right education, some are in the right places, we wear the right lapel pins. Challenge yourself to go beyond that and figure out who are the people you need to speak to build with, so that we can have these kinds of spaces. And the third thing I would say is to affirm yourself. That beauty, that through struggle, through pain, through tremendous achievement, there are people who are in positions to say, I am the result of my grandparents working in a way that I never had to. And how dare I not share that story with our children, because I don't want them to feel different or feel less than. We have an obligation to honor those that went before us and to not be afraid of telling history in its fullness and to build history every day where we are. So I want to thank you again to the Brooklyn Long Island chapter for having us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And again, I will say that from my perspective is that all politics is local. And so like getting in there, like even if you have to vote for the dog catcher, like, you got to get in there and make sure that you know what's happening on that local level, because that will affect your children, what the children are learning, and anything else that's going on around your gerrymandering in your districts, or anything else that's going on. You can't sit up and complain about, things are happening to us, but you're not in the game. You got to get in that game. I don't care. My polling is right around the corner. I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm the first one in that line to make sure that I'm, voting, no matter what race it is. I want to make sure that I'm having my voice heard in that way. So, we talk about voting a lot, but it is so super important, especially as it relates to this issue. So again, to Tamika Robinson, to Angie Hood, and to Kalila Brown Dean, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Be sure to stay tuned to this space hosted by Brooklyn Long Island alumni, as we continue to bring you informative and educational programming. Tune in during the week of May 16th for a special event, a voters town hall with Brooklyn Councilman Shay Osei and State Senator Kevin Parker. We hope to see you there. Until then, stay safe, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.